Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the AI for Good Global Summit, all year, always online. My name is Xenia Fontaine from the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, and I have the privilege of introducing day 3 of the AI for Good Breakthrough Days. ITU is the United Nations Specialized Agency for Information and Communication Technologies, and we are also the organizer of the AI for Good Global Summit alongside X Prize Foundation and in partnership with 36 UN sister agencies, ACM and Switzerland, our co-convener. The goal of the summit is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. Like the most of the world, the AI for Good Summit has gone digital with a weekly programming allowing us to reach even more people across the globe. The heart of the summit has been always organized around the Breakthrough Days. And this year is no exception. We are moving forward with Breakthrough Days, presenting a series of all-star keynotes, interactive workshops, proposals, and key announcements. And of course, we are counting on your participation to create a very engaging discussions. Before I introduce today's moderator, let me go over quickly some housekeeping rules. If you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A tab. The moderator will select and read out the questions to the audience. And I have the first challenge for you. Could you please let us know where you are calling from, which country or which city? Simply use the chat function to communicate and make sure to enable it to everyone, all panelists and attendees. And let me do it first. So I'm calling from Geneva. And we have participants calling from Los Angeles, Lisbon, Geneva, Tunis, Buenos Aires, Iraq, India, Hong Kong, Mexico. Fantastic, welcome everyone. Now I'm pleased to introduce today's moderator, Amir Banifatemi, who is Chief Innovation Officer at X Prize and the AI for Good Program Committee Chair. Amir, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Xenia, for this presentation. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to Day 3 for 2 days. We have a very interesting program for you today, and it's my pleasure to introduce the first keynote speakers of today. Let me introduce and share with you the biography of Emmanuel Faber, who is our first keynote. Emmanuel Faber is the chairman and CEO of Danone. Under his vision and leadership, Danone is today a global food company and the world's leader in dairy and plant-based food. Danone North America is the largest B corporation in the world today. Emmanuel Faber is strongly committed to promote innovative and inclusive business model. In 2005, he supervised the first social business experiment conducted in Bangladesh with Grameen Bank and the creation of Danone communities in close collaboration with the 2006 Nobel Prize winner Mohammed Yunus. Since 2019, Emmanuel Faber spearheads the business for inclusive growth called B4IG, launched in August 2019 in connection with the G7 leaders. B4IG is a first of its kind coalition of 40 leading global companies and partners committed to tackling inequalities and promoting inclusive growth, sponsored by the French President Emmanuel Macron and coordinated with the OECD. In parallel, Emmanuel Faber actively contributes to building a global business movement for biodiversity. As such, launched in 2019 at the United Nations Climate Action Summit in New York, the One Planet Business for Biodiversity Coalition, which he co-leads with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, gathers 19 leading companies joining forces to step up alternative farming practices and protect biodiversity for the benefit of people and planet. Please join me to welcome Emmanuel Faber. Good afternoon, Emmanuel Faber. We're very pleased to meet you, and it's a true pleasure to welcome you today. I learned that we have probably grown in the same city of Grenoble, so that was a happy and interesting fact for me when I was preparing. And we have been following Danone's work for some time. To give some perspective, Mr. Fraber, we have been working towards meeting the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. And during this summit, we have been designing and building the summit about the impact that technologies such as artificial intelligence can help us achieving the goals. So while we work on all SDGs, we have consistently been focusing on 3 of them. SDG number 2, which is fighting poverty, SDG number 3, good health and well-being, and SDG 12, responsible consumption and production. And not forgetting, and most importantly, the collaboration for the goals. We have this year specifically put a specific emphasis on future of food, gender equality, and collective use of intelligence to build resilience. I'm sure these topics are top of mind for you as well. So coming to the future of food today, you have a very unique perspective on the global food system. You're often cited for a new food revolution. I would like maybe to start with your keynote on this topic and understand better what food revolution means, and maybe open up a conversation as we take questions as well to evaluate how we can all participate in a collective goal to meet those sustainable goals for people and planet.
Thank you, Amir, for the nice words, and it's good to hear the fact that you are in Grenoble as well, which continues to be for me a source of inspiration when it comes to my my relationship to mountains and the verticals there. Thank you also for the kind words. I'd like to really start by commending both XPRIZE and the ITU for organizing these events. I think they are taking place at a moment where they are fundamentally needed, bringing thought leadership and collective thinking and creativeness around the topics that I understand you are focused on for the current breakthrough days, which are about the pandemic, food, and gender. What struck me when I was proposed to participate was actually that for me, I cannot answer about food without actually also answering about pandemic and gender. And so I think that this triangle of topics that nourish the SDGs, as you just said, are fundamentals for the discussion. So maybe let me elaborate, and you will see through this what I think we mean when we speak about the food revolution, which certainly has been accelerated by the current pandemic. I'll start by saying that when it comes to the pandemic, there are many ways to look at it, basically. You can say, that's a crisis. We are going to constrain supply through confinement, but also to constrain demand. And the day we reopen, it will restart again. And there are many political leaders, obviously, that are eager to make sure that economy restarts and to make sure that the social crisis, the democracy crisis, will be avoided by a quick restart. I think, unfortunately, that it's unlikely to be and to create resilience, because there is I think another way of looking at it. The reason this virus has been in touch with us is also related to the way we live and the way we've been producing our food for so many years. You could think about, thousands of years ago, probably, and hundreds of years ago, actually, where some local habitats would be containing viruses that our species is not prepared to face, but they would remain somewhere in the forest or in the deep wildness where we are not. But two things happen. First of all, we cut trees to grow massive monocropping agriculture all around the world. That has basically reduced the natural habitats for these forms of life that we are not used to and accustomed to. The second is that we have gathered in cities. So today, 60% of humankind live in only 2% of the surface of the planet, which means that when something happens there, it happens to a lot of people because of the density. So that's the first reason why we were in contact with this virus and that it became a problem locally. But then it became a bigger problem, and actually a global problem, because the virus traveled with our technology. It traveled with our ways of life, taking the trains and the suburbs, and certainly the ships and the airplanes that we're using ourselves. So this pandemic is really something that is related to the way we live, to the way we've organized ourselves, basically not considering nature as being fundamentally an ally, but either neutral to it or destroying it. I think if you think about this and now turn to the second point, which is central to our discussion today, food, the same applies. We are only relying now for the whole of humankind on 6 species of plants for 75% of our total calorie intake. And that's a huge dependency on only a super small fraction of what nature has to offer to us. And we did that because we wanted super big effects of scale. We wanted to focus on the simplest, more effective short-term plants, the less costly plants to grow, to bring that food to as many people as possible in an affordable manner. And yes, that's true. That's what happened. But we didn't see all the unintended collateral consequences, which is this total collapse of not only actually the wild biodiversity, but the cultivated and the domesticated biodiversity. There are studies in the US that show that within the whole, I think 9 or 10 million population of cows, if you look at their DNA, they all track down, 99% of them track down to only 2 individuals, not even speaking about species here, but individuals that were super strong bulls of the 70s. And through artificial insemination, they gave birth not to traditionally what was like 100, but 100,000 of descendants. So that now the lack of diversity is incredibly strong in that herd. And the same applies all across the world. It's very clear that if you only raise chicken that are the best chickens to cut them into pieces and makes the right thing that we find in our supermarkets for barbecues, and you raise hundreds of thousands of them into very limited spaces, and they're all the same species, well, when there is a virus coming, that's a pandemic. If you think about the lack of biodiversity in the wild nature, it's only a reflection of the lack of biodiversity in agriculture. And so there is a deep need to re-inject biodiversity, because this is the only way that we will restore soil health. Monocropping and this monofocus has ruined soil health all over the place, which means over-irrigation, overuse of nutrients, changes in many things, but certainly it's not something where we are building with nature. So it's absolutely fundamental that we re-access to that. And it's not a matter of food safety anymore. It's, for me, a matter of food security, the resilience of the food system. Now, let me link this with gender. There are, I think, 1.7 billion women that live in rural areas. They produce 50% of the worldwide food production. In Asia, actually, these numbers are even bigger, 60%. In Africa, in particular, sub-Saharan Africa, it's 80% of the food that these rural women are producing. They only own 2% of the overall land that is used by agriculture, 2%. And they only get today 5%, less than 5%, of the public aid to agriculture and training. Now, if you think about food security, there are obvious studies that show that in sub-Saharan African countries, if you would swap the role of a man and the role of a woman on an arable land and a farm, you would increase productivity by 20%. If you would reduce the amount of time that women are cooking or going out to find wood because of deforestation, more and more time that they need, like 3-4 hours a day. The same to go and fetch water, and instead reduce this and bring them into the field, you'd increase the overall rural household ability to generate 50% more revenues. And we shouldn't think about these 1.7 billion women as in any way going to be reduced, as in OECD countries where, you know, agriculture workforce has reduced to be only a fraction of the total population. Because in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as in India, there will be hundreds of millions more rural population in 20 years from now than today. Out of the 2 billion additional inhabitants that will come from these two subcontinents, several hundreds more of rural inhabitants. So they are here to stay. And there is no way that we can obtain food security at the global level without focusing on family farming on these areas, and in particular on women. So why all of this is relevant to an AI for Good event? Well, last year, my colleague Cécile, on behalf of Danone, was participating in the event and saying, AI has to be a common good. And I think for Danone, it's very clear. AI can be the best or the worst for humankind, basically. And I think you guys know that much better than I do. So how do we ensure that there is a governance of data, a governance of AI that is empowering people and not enslaving people? If we do that, then AI can obviously do wonders for the food security topic that I just mentioned. Reducing food waste, which would reduce deforestation. Support regenerative agriculture. For instance, Danone has decided that CO2 was not an externality. For us, it's the resilience of agriculture, because it's not only the emissions, but it's actually what agriculture can sink in the soil, because agriculture has this unique ability to be a carbon sinking activity if we do it right with regenerative agriculture. To do this, we need to measure the CO2 footprint on the land used by the farmers upstream our activities. In a number of cases, in our livelihoods fund that is working on regenerative agriculture upstream our activities, we are using technology. We are using drones to measure the size of the trees, the size of the mangroves, the size of the greens that are producing the CO2 footprint, or reducing the CO2 footprint of these rural areas, and that are then being used to transfer and allow us to report our CO2 footprint as a company. And by the way, for the first time ever, last year, we published an earning per share post carbon footprint, the whole cycle of carbon around Danone, not only our direct emissions, but all the emission coming from agriculture. Interestingly enough, we have peaked our carbon emissions, absolute emissions, 5 years in advance of our plan. And now it means that with this carbon charge, accounting charge, going down instead of going up, the earning per share of Danone post-carbon will grow faster than the earning per share of Danone according to the international gaps. So for this, we need technology. One aspect to this is that that needs to be critically worked on is the availability of that technology in rural areas. And frankly, I'm happy to have ITU here with us, because when spending quite a bit of time, in particular in Africa over the last several years, but you mentioned Bangladesh and India, for instance, it's very clear that there is a lack of connectivity, the lack of infrastructure. We will never get the data. If you think about what tech and AI in particular could help when it comes to index insurance on weather, weather forecasts, market price dynamics for farmers that would avoid them to, go and travel for 2 days to the market and not being able to realize the price that they wanted to realize. The data on regenerative agriculture that can be used even for creating public policies on those topics. They need an infrastructure that can capture this data. And today, still, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa, there is a big missing backbone of connectivity. Whether these are the optic fibers or the satellite systems, I think there is an urgency that, in particular, the Broadband Commission, where there is ITU and UNESCO together for sustainable development, is actually ensuring that funds are being directed to create the infrastructure in these old rural areas where these family farmers are producing 50% of the world production of food, and they need the connectivity to have access to the data that will bring and nourish the AI systems. So that's clearly, for me, one of the breakthroughs that need to happen. If you look at these numbers in Africa, it's very clear that in terms of bits per second, or in terms of the cost of accessing internet for users in Africa compared to what it is in OECD countries, for instance, there is a huge gap that creates a barrier for accessing this very important part of the world when we are speaking about food security that derives issues like migration, that derives issues like democracies, and therefore derives the issues of the whole resilience of how we recover from the current crisis, but also from the decades where we've been creating a food system that in many ways is broken, is not able to even address the climate change adaptation that it needs to address super fast. Among the topics I'd like to maybe share is that I think one thing that AI can really do for us is, by the simple brute force of its data power and the ability to treat so many data in the same time, is to help us on the biodiversity and the support of biodiversity. When I speak biodiversity, I'm talking here about agriculture biodiversity for nutritious food. In a number of ways, we have grown food where the cost of calorie has decreased, but the content of calorie, its qualitative content, has decreased as well. There is less calcium today in the milk than 50 years ago. There is less vitamin C in oranges than 50 years ago, because we've chosen species that grow faster because it's more efficient, it's less costly, it goes faster to the market, but it doesn't take the sun as it did before, and it doesn't charge itself with enough vitamin C. So in many juices of orange, you add on artificial vitamin C. So the importance is how sustainable is the agricultural model and how sustainable is the nutrition model that go together. That's the core of the One Planet, One Health framework of action of Danone. And I think that is the fundamental response to this COVID crisis, when we see that, unfortunately, there are huge comorbidity factors of obesity and diabetes against the COVID virus weakness in terms of health conditions and the statistically bigger morbidity for people that suffer these non-communicable diseases, which are related to their diets. So I'll just use one example before I conclude, and then we can go for questions, comments, challenges, and many things. We are super happy to be partners of a startup, which I just want to say a few words about. That's a company called Brightseed in the west part of the US. What they do with their model is that instead of focusing on these few species that I mentioned, they observe the reality, which is that we only know 1% of the overall plant kingdom. So their system, which they call forager for good reasons, is basically exploring super fast, super deep, the 99% that we don't know. On the other side, that's the planet side. On the other side, on the health side, they have scanned with data entirely new ways of understanding the metabolics of human health and the relation between this human condition, health condition, and diets. And where the real power of thing is when you connect both, because they are able to find new applications, new nutritious benefits to plants that exist. And they're also able to map on the needs, nutrition needs, plants that we have no idea about in terms of agriculture, and that are therefore discovered as a potential solution for the future. So a small startup like this one is leveraging the power of AI to create the biodiversity in the fields that we need to address tomorrow the challenges of food, which for me are not about quantities. It's really about making sure that the right food is at the right place. I don't think, and if I'm back for 1 second in my conclusion about AI, I don't think we should look at AI from the top. You know, we, I don't know who is we, but we, the elite, control AI and are basically, you know, giving it or selling it or renting it to the people for their good. We feed the world. No, I don't think large multinational companies like mine feed the world. I think people feed themselves, and we are here to serve them. And that's the whole theme of the food revolution. The food revolution is that people realize that in many ways they have delegated to large brands, large banners, hypermarkets, the responsibility to provide them safe, diverse, nutritious, affordable food. And suddenly they discover that this model has limits, that we are hurting some of its limits: climate, agriculture, irrigation, many things. And therefore people are back to, I want to be sovereign. I want my food sovereignty. That is what they're claiming. In a way, they're claiming that what the UN has called the right to food, they want that. And the choice is for us to serve that revolution or to resist it. No, I want to stay in control. Or, okay, I'm going to see how I can serve you. That's a totally different attitude. And it leads me to my very final word, which I think that it's high time to relocalize the food system. There are many pressures for that, whether they are political. There will be tariff wars, there will be economic wars, there will be trade wars, there will be, you know, government sovereignty decisions, there will be environmental decisions, climate change adaptation. All of this and people's choice will be to relocalize. And I think we need to go there, because one of the aspects today of the food system is that it's overly reliant on a few very complex supply chains. And if there is one problem there, there will be a problem everywhere. So the food sovereignty and resilience will come from the fact that local food traditions should be seen, the diets, the recipes, the ways of cooking in all these different regions of the world locally, as a treasure that we should continue to nourish, because it is creating the diversity that will make the system resistant. Because if there is a problem somewhere, there won't be a problem everywhere. And I'm back to square one with this pandemic. And the fact that it is local will mean as well that it will be nourished and backed by an agricultural model that will precisely fit what environmentally the planet is able to deliver locally. So it's not the end of exchange, it's not the end of the trade, but it's restarting from the base that local is fundamental. And I think the same should apply to AI in my mind, and I'm ready to discuss that with you. Thank you for your attention. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, for this insightful ideas and also the vision that you portrayed. I'd like to talk about three different aspects of what you shared with us. One is you talk about sovereignty of food. In your mind, this sovereignty, is it to be left to governments, to organizations, or to the individual? And if it has to be left to the individuals, what are the ingredients and the mechanics and the frameworks that needs to be in place so that everyone is well informed, able to participate in the decisions around the food system and the flow of nutrition from one place to another, benefit from the global economy, and also not be left out with social injustice related to everything that you mentioned. So is there a framework or a set of guidelines that you have in mind that could help bring sovereignty to the lowest granular level that we can afford to have?
Thanks for the question, Amir. I think it's got to be at the individual level. And basically, that is what you see, frankly, all around the world. The food revolution I'm talking about is not only the one from an elite that can afford buying organic food in natural channels. And yes, that is there, but it's way, way beyond that. It's interesting to see that there are the same patterns for the millennials and even more the Gen Z generation. The pattern when it comes to food topics is much more common in Indonesia, Mexico, Russia, the US, and some European countries than it is in each of these countries with their parents and their grandparents. But what happens is with these young people is that as they're masters of social media, they create social norms. So when we transition, and we have to transition out of a too much animal protein-based diets overall, in particular in the developed quote unquote world, we have to transition out of that and be more flexible. We know that for the planet boundaries, for the planetary diets, they are dragging this because they speak to their friends and to their families, and they convince, and they are militants. So they change things, they make things happen without the government, without the large companies. They operate on their own, and they choose what they want to choose. If you think about these apps that are all over the place to guide consumers in their choice, they're not ruled by governments. And actually, that's one of the topics, by the way, which is that there are, a bit of, frankly, garbage in, garbage out, because not all these apps are fully reliable, in particular when it comes to facts and science and everything else. So we are still at a nascent part of this industry, which is a very important industry, which is how AI, how tech is supporting consumers' choice, exactly what you say, educating people. So we believe it's got to be a function of both. Making sure that the front of pack is clear, that there is access on data for people who choose their products easily, but also that we create a level playing field. And that's a work that is being done by government. So for instance, in Europe, we have a system called Nutri-Score. It was started and piloted by the French government. Danone was the first company to, in our fresh dairy and plant-based business, to start it with Alpro and Danone brands and a number of others. Then we extended it to water. And then now we are extending it to the rest of Europe, as Nutri-Score is going to be the system in Europe. So I think you have to have both, and one needs to guide the other. At the end of the day, all of this has to be collective. We can't succeed on our own. I'd like to take another example, maybe if I can, for a few seconds. We've been working in this coalition that you mentioned that we launched exactly a year ago at the UN, One Planet Business for Biodiversity, which is 25 of the largest company that are using products extracted from the soil. So it can be textile, cosmetics, food, hygiene, household, etc. We've been working as part of this coalition to reintroduce biodiversity in agriculture with a startup called How Good. How Good is super interesting because they are basically linking again the formulation and the nutrition that is derived from using such and such ingredients, but also the social topics that you are talking about. You know, I've said already that I thought that food was a fundamental right, and that market economy could not be resilient if it does not produce social justice. So I'm entirely on this as well. And the fact is that How Good is also tracking human rights in the supply chains and issues that are related to any given specific ingredient. So they're able to map that, and with data, to shape a profile of a product. So when you scan it on the shelf, you basically have your trade-offs. You know, some would be better for the planet, not as good on the social side. So what do I want to do as a consumer? And therefore, all of these, which are going to help people to ask themselves a question, is fundamental, because again, the old model has disconnected people from their food and from agriculture.
Vision of a global traceable food system with enough data that would allow making those trade-offs. How do you balance this global system with the concept of being local and nurturing local ecosystems?
Yes, I think that it's like for us at Danone, we are a company that really relies on local. So I think 95% of what we produce is actually sold in the same country. A few things are being exported, but most of it is locally produced, locally consumed. It does not mean that we don't have one company language. So we are aiming at having one data system, because that is the language. And so as long as we're not talking about autarcic systems, but autonomous systems, it's like a neuronal network. You have these cells, but they speak all together, and they need to speak the same language. And that's where data is for me. So the data interconnection should not be a barrier to have a locally rooted system, but it would be a way to elevate the ability of being more knowledgeable, transparent, and overall more efficient in the way we speak about our food and the way we design it.
I would like to ask you questions about an important player in the chain, which is a local farmer, the small farmer. And talking about AI and machine learning, how do you see technology be an enabler in the service of the small farmer? And could be about inclusion, social impact, economic contribution, or generally speaking, their place in the overall chain. How the small farmers can be empowered with the advances of machine learning and AI. And have another question is about how you can promote more AI contributions. But this small farmer, I think, is an important player in the chain.
It's a huge question, Amir. I mean, if I had the silver bullet answer, no one has the answer to that. It's a very complex and very fundamental question. And when you speak about small family farming, in many ways the truth exists. I mean, that exists as well in OECD countries. So as far as Danone is concerned, we're collecting our milk directly from farmers all around the world. So and they are family farms. Some of them are farming with us for 2-3 generations, some more recently. And it's like, a rotation every week or twice a week, we're visiting them. So we know in our own industry, there are so many others, but we know the reality of the family farming, whether that's in Africa or again in Ukraine or Russia or UK, whatever, US and Argentina, etc. The fact is that there is evidence that these people are incredibly, I insist, knowledgeable, willing to learn, change, and improve. I've been so impressed. But then the question is not so much the technology. I remember a discussion I had, and I think with Mohamed Yunus, who started Grameen Bank, and we've been pioneers together in Bangladesh on this small locally produced fortified yogurt that was sold in the villages with a super small factory that we had built in the northern part of Bangladesh. When the mobile phone technology was launched, I think in 2000 or something in Bangladesh, people immediately mentioned, oh, well, that's a great technology for the elite in Dhaka and Chittagong and a couple of other big cities. But Yunus came and he said, well, give me the license, give me one license, and I will make it work for people that are in the villages, the 60,000 villages of Bangladesh. And people laughed and said, ha, 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 they don't even know how to read and count. So, well, he said, if their living, will rely on the fact that they're able to read the 10 figures, the 10 digits that are going to be there, I can tell you in 1 week, they will learn the digits and they will know how to put the numbers, etc. And they started Grameen Phone like this by having Grameen ladies renting second by second, minute by minute, these phones to the rest of their villagers connected with solar panels for recharging the battery. And indeed, these illiterate women became business people that were just trading time on the phones. And I've seen that with my own eyes, visiting all these villages. And that changed the lives of these people. And I was, talking about the connectivity in Africa because I saw the same there. You all know M-Pesa, the money transfer system on mobile in Kenya that was started by DFID, by Vodafone, by many people, Safaricom, and the government and others. It's incredible because it just changed the way people were using money and made things so much safer and so easier for farmers to be connected to their bank instead of having to travel one way or the other to the midtown, etc., etc. So we should never think about these farmers as being people that need our help. I mean, frankly, I don't think they do. We saw in Araku Valley in India, people just by reorganizing their the footprint of their 1 hectare, growing trees undercover and plants undercover and starting new things, they generated for themselves just by the hard work and being prepared to change their agricultural practices to bring significant cost down and revenue up. The question is, do we get infrastructures, multilateral aid, government money for these farmers or not? I was mentioning the fact that women would only get 5%, not even 5%, whereas they are like 80% of the workforce in Africa of the public aid for agriculture. But the reality is that there is very little public aid for farming, family farming in Africa. You find public aid, I mean international aid from the French AFD or KfW in Germany, DFID, USAID for bigger things. But when it really comes about going deep in the communities and offering training, it's a whole theory of change that is so difficult to track that no one is actually putting the money where it should be. And so I think, again, I don't have any magic thing, because it really starts from considering that these people are autonomous, they know what they're prepared to change, to improve themselves, they need support. I can't say more than this. I mean, I could be much longer on this. I'm conscious I'm probably too long, so I'll stop here.
We'll come back to that. We have a lot of questions, so I would like to take a few questions from the Q&A section to be able to at least get some of these interesting questions presented to you, and we'll try short questions and short answers, and yep. Some of them. So let's just read some of them for you. The first one is that, do you see, and you answered that somehow a little bit earlier, but do you see potential for blockchain solutions in traceability of food, organic pesticides, free, etc.? And do consumers want more information on where the food comes from and what processes is used?
So the super short answer to these questions is yes and yes. I can elaborate more, but that's what it is. I think that blockchain will take a lot of time, but who knows how technology can actually be hyperbolic. But yes, it's definitely part of what transparency can bring, and people will want and will need, and we all need more transparency.
Another question is that, do you consider, and also is Danone looking into, AI and robotics and vertical farming to reduce strain on natural environment and localize the food supply chain?
Yes, we are. We have set 5 years ago now. We've created a venture cap fund called Danone Manifesto Ventures, which is investing in and supporting some of the companies I just described. Actually, I just mentioned the startups, and a dozen other kind of startups, including agriculture, including vertical agriculture, aponomic agriculture. Urban agriculture, because we believe there are bricks of solutions for tomorrow. They may not bring, they won't be the solution, but for me, they are clearly one of the solutions that we need to develop indeed. Yes.
Thank you. Another interesting question, which is, what is your personal view about the dairy industry's impact on global emissions currently? And what is your framework for seeking solutions?
Yeah. So couple of things here, and I'll try to be very short. One is agriculture accounts for the same CO2 emissions net than the whole of industry. The difference is that agriculture can sink carbon back in the soil, and we need to come up with solutions like this. The second is that, of course, dairy has a carbon footprint that is high, but there are many ways to improve it, in particular nutrition. Cows are ruminants, and if you give them the compounds of soy that have become the totally non-biodiverse kind of nutrition for cows today, they emit a lot of methane. If you give them linseed and grass, you can divide by 5 the carbon emissions or the methane emissions of cows, simply because they are built to eat grass, not grounds of compounds of soy and maize, etc. So the nutrition is critical, and we are back to the question of diversity. The third aspect is that we believe that people will need to become flexitarians, and we are pushing hard. We are the largest plant-based alternative to dairy business in the world. We acquired White Wave, Silk in the US, Alpro in Europe, and a number of other brands 4 years ago. It's been a mega deal for us. But we know that we need to shift and support people shifting their diets. Is that going to be the end of dairy? My simple answer is no, because there is no way in the next 30 years that there will be farming without raising animals. For many, many reasons, that does not fly. So it's got to be a totally different kind of raising animals and taking care of animals, but there will be animal farming for a long, long time. That will need to be reinvented in the way we deal with that.
Super interesting, and I think we don't necessarily have the vision that you have and the knowledge about the length of time that it takes to transform habits or farming or agriculture. Talking about agriculture, there's a questions about, in your opinion, and also it seems that one of the biggest challenges of using AI in agriculture is the lack of technological training and digital skills. And while we don't necessarily have to have everybody be trained, how can we overcome that challenge?
Wow.
If the question is clear.
It's a complex decision for a guy that does yogurt. I'm not an expert in AI and digital, so but in many ways, yes, I think it's back to what I said about training. I mean, I don't think that, put it this way, no one would be using AI based applications. I mean, I'm using Spotify, And Spotify is bringing me new lists of music every week that are better because I'm training without even knowing it, this app. And so I don't think that the farmers need to be super involved in AI and tech. They need to have apps that are allowing them to be the right interconnection with the big AI system that's behind. But I'm sorry, it's like a general answer.
Well, I think that's an important one because from the industry perspective, you want to simplify usage of technology and not making it super difficult. And
Yes.
We have been using this term of problem owners versus problem solvers.
Yes.
And if the problems are well identified and to the core, it's easier to align engineers, scientists, and technology providers to help with those problems. Like we don't always have this well framed out. I'm going to go to two more questions briefly. The next question is that, are there any initiatives Danone is undertaking to support women's health and economic empowerment so they can get financial backing, credit, and support from investors to increase their chance of being truly sustainable entrepreneurs and not subsidized? You mentioned the work that you've done with Mohammed Yunus, which we had as a guest talking about the Global Data Pledge. But borrowing from that experience and your overall experience, how do you see empowering women, and specifically women in the farming industry or in the food system?
Yes, well, I'll give you an answer to this in the sense that we have created 10 years ago an endowment fund taking profits from the business with the support of our shareholders to work on capacity building for the most vulnerable members of the broader job ecosystem of Danone. So around Danone, not our employees, but the people in the farms, the scavengers in the landfills, the street vendors in Mexico or Buenos Aires, etc. As well as the farmers, as I mentioned before, with the funds in tropical zone, Africa, Indonesia, Bangladesh, India, Guatemala, etc. All of them are focused on women. And the experience with Mohammed Yunus in Grameen was focused on women, is focused on women. The people that are distributing the product have been in the villages, have been trained about the nutritious aspect of this small yogurt, and they are going door to door as entrepreneurs to sell this nutritious food to the families surrounding in the villages. So empowering women to bring them economic autonomy has been the driver behind the effort that for the last 10, 15 years we've been doing to work on the food ecosystem around Danone.
Let me go to one more question. This one is about the role of harmful pesticides on agriculture, not only in developed nations, but also developing countries that have been known to be cancer-causing. And how is the model taking that into account if we really want to focus on food security, since they have all interlinked and have tremendous impact on the biofood chain across the environment? You did mention that in your presentation. Is there any short takeaway or quick soundbite answer that we can have a good understanding of this topic?
Yes, it's a complex topic in terms of transition, but let me say the following. We have only focused on a few plants, and within a few plants, a few species, varieties and species, because we felt they were bringing the best yields efficiently. That led to, as I just said, monocropping all over the place. So we have basically decided that we would not look at nature-based solution. There are many ways of getting away from most pesticides by changing the seeds that you're using, by mixing what we call toxicoecology and socioecology, which is that if you put plants together, they are protecting each other against pests. It's very clear between, for instance, carrot and leek. Put them together, they protect each other in the soil and out of the soil. So that's a very simple example, but there are thousands of such examples. So what needs to happen is that governments need to stop subsidizing the use of chemical entrants and start subsidizing agricultural practices that are regenerative, that are recreating soil health, because the plants would be more powerful if there were more natural nutrients in the soil, and forever, not because you bring another cycle of nitrogen with artificial nitrogen being involved there, because we've been ruining the soil by taking the carbon out of it. So it's a whole system. If you go to agroecological systems and regenerative agriculture, you will not need by far the quantity of pesticides that are being used today. Can we go entirely out of pesticides? I don't know, but so much that we can avoid, that I think that's absolutely where we should be going.
Thank you. A very clear answer. I'd like to ask an important question. I'm trying to be clear when I ask this question. You mentioned you have a fund and an endowment, and you're investing into not only startup but also initiatives. If you had the power today to, or imagine that you would be investing in not only technology, AI is one of them, for the common good, and balance common good and economic growth, and knowing that the best investments are the ones that are supported by other investors and governments to make them sustainable and continued sustainability, what would you invest in today?
You cannot ask me this question, Amir. I mean, it's an impossible question to answer because there are so much if and given that and etc. What I would certainly say is that
at least on AI.
I truly believe in the power of collective. That's the only thing I should say. The power of collective. Because none of the difficult problems that we've been talking for and that you are addressing with these days have been solved by the market, by economy, the private sector. None of them has been solved by government. None have been solved by NGOs. Otherwise, you would not be discussing them. They would be solved. So it's very clear for me that the solution has got to be a collective, coalitions, basically. So that's one. And whatever the topics we've been discussing, none of that can Danone do it alone? No, absolutely not. We need to work with many others. And the second aspect I would bring is the diversity of coalitions. But I would also say, for me, I would invest in the diversity of AI systems and making sure that, maybe it's a challenge for all the community around this discussion. The worst thing for me that could happen to humankind is that AI is actually standardizing through data the languages that we're using. And if you standardize the language, you are sterilizing the thought, because the language creates the thought. So how can you ensure that you design a system that accepts diversity, that accepts exceptions, that accept to be self-disrupted? Because that's the only way to maintain it in the service of life. So if I was going to invest in one aspect of it, that's the one, because I haven't seen it cracked, and I'm sure it has not. But that's for me an underlying topic that if AI is successful, say 10 years from now, if we do not embed that ability to respect diversity, then we run a big risk of having the unique thought because everyone's thinking with the same language. So, I'll give it that back to you, and I'm prepared to invest in systems that would prevent that from happening.
Thank you very much for this answer. And I know it was not an easy question because it's very large and has multiple layers into it. But I was hoping that you were talking about a collaboration. We talked about SDG 17, which is the collaboration for the goals.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's one way and one framework to use. But I think you highlighted beautifully the need to be respecting diversity, traditions, languages, and understanding, and connecting all together. And I think this is a strong invitation for many to listen to this conclusion that you made, which I think is very powerful because it sums it up. And I think the future is about collective and collaborations and coalitions and joining forces to make a better sustainable life. And I think we have been very inspired by you today. And thank you so much for your insight. I would be delighted. Thank you so much. And I think everyone has been extremely happy to be attending this. And by the way, we have been on YouTube and Facebook Live as well. So many other people are watching this live.
Great.
As well. And
Thank you for inviting me,
to join me to thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amir. Thanks. Be well, everyone.
Bye. I think you would probably agree that this was a very insightful keynote and talk and conversation. And this is a good foundation for now to invite our dear friend and one of the pillars of AI for Good, Francesca Rossi, that has been with us since the beginning of AI for Good Summit since 2017. For those who don't know Francesca, let me introduce her briefly. She's an IBM fellow and the IBM AI Ethics Global Leader. And prior to joining IBM, she was a professor of computer science at the University of Padova in Italy. As far as her research interest goes, Francesca is focusing on AI in general, but specifically on constraint reasoning, preferences, multi-agent systems, computational social choices, and collective decision-making. We just talked about collective with Emmanuel. I think collective decision-making is a very important topic. She's also interested in ethical issues in the development and behavior of AI systems, and in particular for decision support systems, for group decision-making. Again, we have this group concept that it seems to be foundational. On these topics alone, she has published over 200 scientific articles in journals and conferences proceedings and book chapters. She's a fellow of many associations. It's too many to name. Of course, the Worldwide Association of AI, the European Association of AI, fellow of the Future of Life, an advisor on Future of Life Institute, the deputy director of the Levelham Center. She's executive committee of the IEEE Global Initiative on Ethical Consideration of AI. And she is also the board member and director and representing IBM on the Partnership of AI. And she's a lead expert for a European Commission high-level expert on AI and general chair of the AAAI 2020 conference. And she's been nominated to be the AAAI or Global Association of AI president in 2022 and 2024. As we talked about the evolution of AI for Good, I know very few people that can talk about the past few years of how AI for Good has evolved and give us a perspective of where we are today and where we are going. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Francesca to give us her perspective.
Thank you, Amir.
Francesca, welcome.
Thanks. Thank you, Amir. Thank you for inviting me to give my perspective of how we got here and what we need to do to move forward. Let me share my screen. Can you see the screen? The presentation?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
Okay. So, when Amir asked me to talk about my perspective on the evolution of AI for Good, I thought that there is an interesting, interaction between these areas, which are definitely overlapping a lot, but they're not really exactly the same. So AI ethics and AI for Good. So let me start with AI ethics, which I think has a broader scope and includes, of course, the fact that you use AI for good, social good applications. But then the AI for Good applications also has its own specific issues and challenges. So let me start with AI ethics, and let's start defining in a very simple term what AI ethics is about. So AI ethics is a very multidisciplinary field of study, not just experts of AI, but also experts in many other disciplines, especially in social sciences like sociologists, psychologists, philosophers, economists, and even policymakers and so on. So very multidisciplinary. And these people together try to understand how to design and build systems that in some sense are behaving in a way that that are framed by our values, the values that we care about. And of course, the overall goal is that we want them to behave according to our values because we want to optimize, maximize the beneficial impact of AI while addressing the possible negative outcomes. And by doing that, this field of studies, since again it is multidisciplinary, there will be some solutions that are technical, so possibly given by AI experts, but some other solutions that are non-technical, that have to do with best practices, have to do with standards, have to do with lessons learned, guidelines, and so on. So things that are beyond the technical solutions. And how come this field of AI ethics came about? Why we need AI ethics and not just the ethics of technology in general? So let me refer this to what is specific to AI in this field of AI ethics. And let me start by defining what AI is right now, given where it started. So this is a very, very brief history of AI. Of course, AI has been around since the 1950s, but at the beginning, it was mostly about building machines by defining the algorithms that were able to solve problems in an intelligent way, whatever that means, so to find the best way to solve a problem. These algorithms were defined by human beings, by the researcher, the developer, and then they were coded into the machines. So from then on, that machine was going to be able to solve those problems according to the recipes, these algorithms that the researchers have put together. Then in the 80s, another approach came about where researchers said, okay, but there are some problems where maybe I can do better by not telling the machine exactly what to do, the algorithm, the steps to perform, but I can do better by just telling the machines examples of problems and their solutions. And then I let the machine, I just code into the machine an algorithm that allows the machine to learn from these examples so that it can behave well according to this example. It can generalize to situations that it's never seen before. And recently, the deep learning approach, which is a specialization of machine learning, is a specialized way where it used, neural nets with more layers, but the overall idea is similar, at least in the supervised case. So this is a fundamental difference. And of course, we know that this approach, this machine learning approach, is very successful in some domains. For example, in problems that are not easily, where it's not easy to define the problem exactly and to define the steps to solve the problem, like in problems related to perception, interpreting an image or interpreting what's written in a text and so on. So these approaches work very well now and are very pervasively used. Although the other approaches still continue to be used in conjunction with these or by themselves. And the characteristic of this machine learning approach is that they need, of course, examples, as we said. So they need a lot of data. And so since they need a lot of data, they also need a lot of computing power to handle the data. And so that's why they were defined in the 80s, but they are successfully used now only because in the 80s we didn't have that amount of data and computing power. So now let's see whether this definition of AI brings us to AI ethics issues that are specific to AI. And in some sense, I think they are. Because again, as we said, AI needs a lot of data. So there are questions around data privacy and governance because of that. Also, sometimes this machine learning approaches is not easy to understand how the output comes from the input. So we need, it's kind of a black box. So we need a lot of think about explainability and transparency. Also, now AI techniques now with these additional perception capabilities can achieve by themselves, can get to decisions, autonomous or in form of recommendations to be given to a human being. So there are questions about whether by making this decision, this system actually follow our values. In fact, for example, they are fair in the fairness, according to some fairness definition that is appropriate for the scenario. Also, these machine learning approaches are based on statistics, and so they cannot guarantee correctness 100%, so they always have even a very small, but a small percentage of error. So the questions about accountability and responsibility when that error is made. And also AI can infer from this data, can infer our preferences and possibly use our preferences in some way. So there are issues about human and moral agency. And finally, AI, compared to other technologies, is very fast at being, widely spread and pervasive in our society. So there are issues about the impact of AI on society and on jobs. So that's why, more or less, this designs the whole space of the AI ethics issues that are the main ones that people consider in this area of AI ethics, that are exactly the ones that I said in my previous slide. So now, how did we get here? How did we get to put together this framework for AI ethics with these multidisciplinary studies and so on? So let me start from where I think this overall endeavor started, from my personal point of view, at least. And this started in 2015. Okay. In 2015, there was a conference in Puerto Rico in January, organized by the Future of Life Institute. And this conference was on AI safety. And the title of the conference was The Future of AI, Opportunities and Challenges. And it was not a big conference. It had about 80 people. You can see them all here. But it was the first time, at least for me, to get to an extremely multidisciplinary convening of people. There were AI people, from academia, from other research centers. There were philosophers, there were psychologists, there were lawyers, there were entrepreneurs, so there were science fiction writers, so extremely interdisciplinary to understand what the future of AI should be in a way that is as beneficial as possible. And attached to this conference, there was also a publication of an open letter on research issues about robust and beneficial AI, an open letter that is still on the web, on the website of the Future Life Institute, that has been signed by many, many thousands of people, AI experts and none. And also attached to this conference was a 10 million grant given by Elon Musk at that time for putting together a research program handled by the Future of Life Institute to support projects around AI safety and beneficial AI. So solid, research projects around this topic. So to me, that was the start of this multidisciplinary frame of mind around AI and AI ethics. And then the next step was also organized by the same entity. This was 2 years later, but I don't want to say that nothing happened in those 2 years, many other events, but this was also another milestone in my view. 2 years later, again in January, the Future of Life Institute organized another conference, this time in California, in Asilomar, on beneficial AI. This time there were about 250 people, and again, you see them all here. Again, very, very multidisciplinary. And the goal of the conference, of course, the event was to discuss principles that would be kind of overall and globally accepted as principles to guide the development of the future of AI. And of course, we started from many principles, more than 100, and then we ended up with 23 principles that are the ones whose topic are written here. And all the people at the conference basically could vote which principles they like the most, and these 23 are the ones that achieved almost unanimity for all of the 23, and so that's why they were selected out of the 100 that we started from. So the principles are how, yes, ethics and values are at the center. So what are the properties related to the technologies, so that we want to make sure that in developing the technologies, in the behavior of the technology, in the use of the technology, we are following our values and ethical consideration, but also principles about how research should be conducted, so collaborative, open, and so on, and also issues about longer term issues about control, artificial general intelligence, human level intelligence, and so on. And these principles are even now, cited as one of the main influential and also one of the first pioneering sets of principles about AI. Then, in the same year, my company, IBM, together with other 5 companies that you see here, Amazon, Microsoft, DeepMind, Facebook, and Apple, we were meeting as researchers. We were meeting in various venues about AI ethics. And at some point we said, well, we think that not one single company can actually understand how to address this AI ethics issue, or even how to define this AI ethics issue by itself. So we should get together and think about it together, but not just together as companies, but together with all the other voices, all the other stakeholders. So that's where the partnership of AI idea came about. And right now, it was started by the 6 company. Right now it has about 100 partners. Each partner is either a company or a non-for-profit organization, a university, a research center, a UN agency, a civil society organization like ACLU and many others. And right now, out of 100 partners, only 20 are companies, and everybody else is all these other stakeholders. So, and what the Partnership on AI does to build projects that where collaborative, various stakeholders get together, not necessarily all 100 of them, but in a balanced way between profit and non-profit, to address one of the issues around AI ethics, whether it's about fairness or transparency or explainability or impact on jobs and whatever. So here, the 8 sentences that I wrote here are the 8 tenets of the Partnership on AI. So again, some sort of principles that the Partnership on AI wants to be based on, where every partner that joins the Partnership on AI has to sign. So has to sign that he will adhere to these tenets. So there are tenets, as you see, about more or less more focused about how we want the partnership to function. So be beneficial to make sure that AI is as beneficial as possible for as many people as possible. To educate and listen to all the stakeholders, to do open research, again, multi-stakeholders in the business community, but also in the other areas of our life, of course, maximize the beneficial effect and minimize the challenges. And this number 6 actually is a much longer tenet that I couldn't, with many sub-bullets that I could not include here. A lot of emphasis on explainability about the technology and the cooperation and openness. Okay, so in the same year, it also companies started to individually also to come up with, grapple with what it meant for them individually as a company to define these principles within their own company. Because of course, every company is different, has its own business model and its own way of operating. Some companies are local, some companies are global, some are small, some are big. So each company started to think about what it means for that specific company. And of course, IBM was one of the first one to do that by publishing these principles of trust and transparency. So the idea is here that IBM said, for us, the purpose of AI is not to replace human intelligence, to augment human intelligence. And this is also because we deliver AI to other companies. So we are going to deliver AI to support the decision-making of professionals in these other companies. Then a principle is about data and insight that belong to their creators, and we are not reusing them for other projects or other clients. And then about transparency and explainability, which is very important, even if you are supporting human decisions, because of course, to build an effective human machine team, you need transparency and explainability. But this principle also said that trust, the notion of trust was introduced. So we said, okay, but what does it mean to trust an AI system? Well, it means we spelled it out in those 4 pillars: fairness, robustness, explainability, and transparency. So here in 2017, we laid out the initial framework or initial frame of mind around our approach to AI ethics. And also many other companies also try to understand individually what it meant for them. Another initiative that I think it was very influential around AI ethics and also AI for good is the IEEE initiative on the ethics of autonomous and intelligent systems. This is already still ongoing. It started in 2016, and basically delivered this book that you see the cover here. It's called Ethically Aligned Design. It involved more than 700 experts globally. It has almost 300 pages, and this principle has many chapters, each one for a specific topic of AI ethics, and it listed a lot of issues in that topic and possible recommendations for engineers, because IEEE is the worldwide association of all the electrical engineers, so the developers of these AI systems. So guidance and education and recommendations for these developers on how they should develop AI in a way that some desirable properties there. And the whole book and the whole initiatives with many other sub-parts of the initiative, not just the book, for example, also several standards on AI ethics. And the whole initiative is based on these general principles that have to do with, again, human rights, data agency, effectiveness, transparency, accountability, awareness of misuse, and competence. So you see that it's a slightly different way to state the principles, but related to what I mentioned earlier as a set of principles. Now, so here, you saw, multi-stakeholder initiatives, you saw multidisciplinary convening of various stakeholders, individual companies, the developers community, and then also governments came about, and they say, well, we also want to understand what AI ethics means in our regional, in our own region of the world. So here I give you the example of the high-level expert group on AI that was put together by the European Commission to understand what this AI ethics was going to mean for Europe, for example. This is a group of 52 people that worked for 2 years, from June 2018 to June 2020, and delivered these 4 main documents that you see here, and which the most influential one was about spelling out the requirements for what we called trustworthy AI. So again, the notion of trust enters here as a central topic. So what are these? How did we get to these 7 key requirements? We started with human rights, then we get to principles, and then we got to these requirements that have to do, again, with more or less the same topics that I mentioned before, around what is the what are the properties of the technology that we want once deployed, and what's the ecosystem and framework that we want to put in place around the technology to make sure that it's as beneficial as possible. And then the other documents are also about recommendations, of course, for the policymakers, for the European Commission, around policies and investments for trustworthy AI, in Europe. Okay, so the latest initiative that I want to mention that started very recently in 2020 is an initiative where not companies, not one single government, but now several governments decided to get together in a global collaborative way to understand with a very big community of experts in AI and other disciplines to understand what's the best way to collaborate globally as governments based on the expert knowledge to make sure that AI is as beneficial as possible. So there are, in this global partnership on AI, there are already 15 countries. It was started as a bilateral agreement between France and Canada, but now it has 15 countries all over the world. And it has 4 working groups: responsible AI, data governance, future of work, innovation and commercialization. And again, it is based on some shared principles that are given by the OECD in this case, that have to do with national and international cooperation, and then also, again, the responsible stewardship, again, of trustworthy AI. So again, trust is part of the picture. So this is more or less the evolution of the AI ethics field. But and now I want to show you this because as you could see from what I told you, every initiative tried to come up with its own view from its own point of view, of the principles that are needed around AI. So, and there were so many initiatives that were put together in the last 4 years or 5 years that somebody counted them and put them together. So, and there are more than 84, I think, sets of principles. Here is a visual representation, a very nice visual representation put together by the Principles AI project of the Berkeley Klein Cyber Law Clinic at Harvard University. This was done in 2019. And here it's even impossible to read, of course. And if you go to their website, there is a way to zoom this visual because so that you can see clearly, who are the stakeholders publishing those principles and so on. And here the main actors here are private sectors, intergovernmental, multi-stakeholder, government, civil societies, all these that I mentioned before, just giving you a few examples. But they all published different sets of principles, but they all have this overlap, of course, into these main themes that I wrote here. And as you can see, they are very, very similar to the ones that we started from. So now, of course, why did I want to show you this list of principles, visualization of the list of principles? Because, of course, yes, now governments have this principle, companies have their principles, multi-stakeholder organizations have their principles, and so on. Now it's time to go from the principles to the practice. And in fact, there are a lot that has to be done within each ecosystem to actually operationalize these principles. You need to put together guidelines, best practice, standards, toolkits, educational activities, revision of the developer's pipeline for developing AI system, define methodologies for them, incentivize adoption of that methodology, put together the governance inside the company that can oversee these all activities. So this is all needed within each ecosystem to make sure that these principles that do not remain principles but are operationalized. And of course, it has to be done again in a multi-stakeholder and multidisciplinary approach. Now, let's go to this AI for good. Of course, AI for good is mentioned in every one of these sets of principles, but in some sense, it had a parallel story that started even much earlier than the AI ethics. So the first time, I think the first initiative I would like to mention here is in 2008 that a colleague, a friend of mine at Cornell University received this NSF big grant, 10 million grant, to define this computational sustainability new area. And again, this was the start of thinking how we can use current existing AI capabilities to solve problems that are related to social good, environmental, economic, or any kind of problem that have to do with a sustainable future. So some projects, for example, have to do with planning, optimization for wildlife preservation, for biodiversity, mapping of poverty, combining learning with inference to accelerate the discovery of new material, for example, and so on. So that was the start of a whole field, which is now called computational sustainability, that has its own conferences, its own venues, and so on, that is less multi-stakeholder than AI ethics, but is really very practical in trying to understand how to solve these important problems related to the societal good. So the next initiative that I want to mention, that again started a long time ago, around 2010, is an initiative by another colleague of mine, Millie Tambe, that was at University of South California, now is at Harvard, that is really around AI for social good. So his team is called Team Core, and has to do with, again, social work, public health, decision making, conservation, safety and security, and he uses techniques, and now also the COVID-19 pandemic, and it uses techniques that have to do with game theory, machine learning, planning, multi-agent systems to address these very important issues around social good. The next one is the IBM Science for Social Good. So this IBM Science for Social Good within IBM started in 2016, and it's a very good example of something that was done at the beginning to really connect the talent within IBM research with the new generation of students, PhD students that are interested in AI, to educate them in understanding how AI can be developed in a multi-stakeholder environment and for social good purposes. So this is a program that every year at IBM Research, we host a number of PhD and postdoc students that are mentored by IBMers on projects that have to do with social good. Here you see some of them. Where the data and the definition of the project is not given by IBM, is not given by the student, but is given by a third party, so a foundation or a UN agency, so some third party that has to do with having the data and understanding the problem in depth. So it's really, to me, it's a really learning experience for IBMers, of course, but I think it's a very important learning experience for the students that not only learn how to apply some AI techniques to some domain, but also learn to work with in this multi-stakeholder environment and for social good purposes. Of course, all these AI for good initiatives compared to the AI ethics initiatives are more focused on the vision of the future. So that's the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are usually taken as the vision of the future where we want to get. And then they try to understand that this initiative, how to build a trajectory for AI from where we are so that we get closer to that to that vision of the future given by the Sustainable Development Goals. The AI ethics initiatives are more general. They are not focused on specific applications, although they have this AI for social good, initiative within them. But since they're more general, they don't focus on a specific vision of the future. Although, of course, they want a beneficial future and the impact of AI, but they focus more on an incremental view, which is also needed, by saying this is the state of AI, this is the concerns that we have now, explainability, robustness, fairness, and so on. So how do we tackle them? How do we address them? So in a way that as we advance the AI capabilities, we also advance our understanding of how to address those issues. So here I just put something that, yes, that's the vision of the future, but I mean, we have to be conscious that we are not really getting very, in a very good trajectory to get closer to that vision. So here there are some examples that we are not really in a good track in terms of the poverty SDG or the climate crisis or the sustainability or food or violence or and so on. So there is a lot of work to be done, even with that vision of the future. And so that's why we need to leverage the best voices and the best talents in all the disciplines together, of course, with the AI experts. One thing that we did within the IBM Science for Social Good program that I think it can be relevant more generally is it said, okay, we do all these projects and we're very happy with all these projects for what we learn at IBM, what the students learn, but these are all ad hoc. Every time we start from scratch in some sense. And so instead, this is not going to scale and we need to understand how to scale it. And we brainstormed and we said that yes, to scale we need many ingredients. We need of course a platform for collaborating, an infrastructure for the platform where people can actually collaborate. We need to understand whether there is some pattern that it gets repeated so that we can leverage that pattern and make it available for the whole community. And then, as Amir said also in the previous question answer, we need the right business model to make it sustainable also economically to scale these social good programs. So here, for example, is a way to see, how we looked at several problems that were all related to some healthcare issue, like a Zika virus, the cognitive diseases, cancer treatment, antibiotics, and recently, of course, the COVID-19. And we say, what is common here? What is the pattern that we can identify? And then once we identify this pattern, how can we use it to make it available to the whole community? So that's why we built a platform infrastructure, for example, that here is related to the generation of AI for molecular discovery, and that we used made it available for the entire community to actually specifically in the last 6 months for exploring and identifying promising molecules for the COVID-19 crisis. So of course we didn't just put in place the necessary tools. We understood that we also needed to support these tools with a lot of computing power. That's why we injected them into this COVID-19 high performance computing consortium that leverage a lot of computing power from many companies and many hardware providers to really make that. So that is an example where we understood what the pattern, that repeating pattern was, and we leveraged that to build tools and in a platform that then can be used by the whole community into a framework, such as in this case the high performance computing consortium for COVID-19. And the business model, as I said, is also very important. We need to understand what is needed for making the AI for good business model being sustainable. Of course, we need the funders of the stakeholders' voices. We need, of course, the problem solvers and the technology experts, but also we need the domain experts. And this is, I think, is very much in line with what this forum, the summit, has tried to do over the years, starting in 2017. So the overall goal, as you know, was to connect as Amir says many times, the problem solvers, so the AI experts, and the problem owners, so the UN agencies, or those that are on the ground and understand really the problems and the features of the problems to be solved, and have the data that can help specify the problem. And as you can see here, the fact that there has been this incredible growth in attention and in interest for the AI for Good Global Summit shows that there was really the need, that there was something missing in this connecting these two, and I would say even more than two communities, because again, we want a multi-stakeholder approach. Another related thing is the fact that we need also to have safe and safe experimental environments where AI and the other AI experts and the other stakeholders can connect and can try out solutions or possible solutions for certain problems. So how do we share resources? How do we share rules of access to these resources, as well as sandboxes, places that we can experiment without really impacting directly explicitly on real life? And how do we make up the governance of this? And this is the AI Commons idea that Amir again pushed so much for, starting in 2016, and I think is having a lot of success, a lot of interest, because again, that was something that was really missing. So we are really in a good track here with this initiative. The last thing, which in my view is not the last one, because I am an AI expert, I am an AI researcher, is this question. I mean, is current AI technology ready to provide us everything we need to address AI, to address social good problems? Well, I think it's not ready. So of course, it can be successfully applied in many different ways, but it would be even more useful if we had these additional things. So, for example, current AI is very good at finding correlations, hidden correlation, in the sense that we humans can't even see, in huge amounts of data. But correlations are not everything we need. We need also to understand causality, because correlations allow for predicting things that will happen, but it will not allow for intervening, because it does not allow for counterfactual reasoning, for what-if reasoning. So causality, understanding, and reasoning is really very important, and current AI is still lacking a lot in that respect. Also, AI reads a huge amounts of data, and sometimes we don't have that huge amounts of data. So we need to understand how to build an AI system that can learn to solve a problem, but with little data as well. Also, AI is not really able to adapt easily to new environments. When there are some events that disrupt the current trend, AI is kind of lost. And we have seen that also with the COVID-19. Many companies that were relying on AI for the prediction on the demands, on the sales, and so on, they were in trouble, because all our patterns of behavior, of buying things, and so on, were all disrupted by the current emergency and the crisis related to COVID-19. So AI does not know how to well adapt to new environments. These are all things that humans know how to do. We can learn with little data. We can adapt to new environment. We can do counterfactual reasoning, and we can infer causality. So that's why in my latest project, but I'm not the only one, but many people in the AI community are trying to exploit what we know of the human mind, and what causes our desired capabilities, like adaptability and so on. What are the causes of our capability? And for example, two theories of human minds that that we are currently looking at is the Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, and also the theory of the philosopher Yuval Noah Harari. And so by looking at these theories, we can possibly better understand, although they're just theories and we know that we know very little about our mind as well, we can understand how to inject these causes of desired human capabilities into machines, so that maybe then we can have machines that have those capabilities as well. As a summary, I would say that, yes, we have gone a long way in very few years. So I'm really amazed about all the things that has been done. And we should be proud of everything that we did, all the convening and all the discussions, all the principles, all the everything. But now we need a lot of more work to do. First of all, we all need to work in going from principles to practice, operationalizing AI ethics principles. I am personally spending much of my time, and on many others within IBM, in doing that within the company with our internal AI ethics board, the governance, and all the other work streams that we have around that. But I think that this should be done more globally, not within each company, but also more globally. Also, we have to work and connect these two approaches. The approach that says, let's advance AI and address the challenges that we see on the way, and the other approach that says, let's look at the vision of the future and let's try to kind of reverse engineer how we want AI to get to that future. The third one, again, understand much better how to make this AI for good programs to scale. So how to define platforms, patterns, platform, business models, and so on to scale. How to share data, models, and solutions. So the AI Commons is one initial approach, but we need a lot more work in that space. Again, how to make these business models sustainable. And then again, the last thing that I mentioned, how to advance AI to support those capabilities that are really needed in addressing in the best way the social good problems. So causality, adaptability, data challenges, and so on. So I will stop here and I'll welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Francesca. I think this is a wonderful overview of just 5 years of a whole industry and ecosystem, and probably there is like the iceberg, right? Probably there is a lot more that have happened globally in many countries that we have not seen. We have a little bit, a few more minutes to basically go to some questions, and I would like to, if you agree with that, I have more questions myself, but I want to just basically pay tribute to the audience, and if we can go very quick answers so we can get more of them answered as well. So let me read some of them quickly. One question is that could you translate the ethics framework to a specific context, for instance, climate?
Yeah, so that is something that I mean, there are some initiatives related to specific social good issues like climate, poverty, or medical emergencies, healthcare, and so on. But I think that we need to do more about these sectorial, and problem-specific frameworks. Yes, there are initiatives that think specifically about one problem, but I agree that we need to do a lot more in defining what are the challenges in that particular issue around the social good. So I think that that's another dimension that I should add, more problem-specific frameworks.
So the similar questions that came up, and you answered, I think, part of that, which is how do you consider the ethics of AI potential impact on broader planetary health? But I would like to add specifically on gender as well, because gender is one of the topics of this year. So how these principles and these AI potential impact on health and gender could be understood.
Yeah, so in fact, I mean, as you know, I'm part of the putting together this gender equity track at this summit, and I was amazed to see about all the project proposals that we received about all the possible dimensions and kind of solutions around the gender equity in AI and in general in society through AI. And I think that there are so many dimensions, and I saw so many technical solutions, but also non-technical solutions. So guidelines, best practices, education. For example, I think there is one project about recommendations and educations for judges in the judicial system around gender equity. Then there are other ones about data sharing about gender issues. So there are so many dimensions, and I hope that even the project that we did not select, because we had to select 3 of them, that I hope that all of them can be made visible and exposed to the whole community, so that they can be picked up possibly and also scaled. Because again, one other issue that we said about those projects, that we hope that by exposing them to this AI for Good community, they can actually be scaled much more.
I would like to ask 2 more questions very briefly because they seem important. One of them comes, and the formulation is the following. It looks like there is quite a bit of room for interpretation and scope to selectively apply those principles on the partnership on AI, or the general ethical principles and the tenets, or the principles from the future of life. How do you make sure that they are fit for purpose and drive desired behaviors?
Yeah, so as I said, the principles are usually, all these principles are very high level, okay? And that's good, I think, because they give general values, ideas that and point of view around at very high level. But then we need to operationalize. So, for example, at IBM, we said, okay, we have these 3 very nice principles, but then we couldn't tell the developers, now follow these principles and develop AI following that principle. The gap is too big. You need to go much with many different initiatives and guidelines and education and pipeline revision and adoption and discussion and so on, because to go from the principles to actual concrete things that developers or anybody can understand how to act. So I agree there is a lot of left to interpretation, but in each context, then one interpretation has to be chosen and then implemented.
One last question, which is, where do or will the developing nations, specifically those that are almost invisible in the world map, stand in this AI race? And after the Industrial Revolution, this is supposed to be a chance, what could be a game changer for small developing nations. How do you see that?
Yeah, so I think that some of the initiatives that I mentioned also include developing nations, exactly because they need to be present. It's not just multi-stakeholder voices in one country, but also multi-stakeholder, because we want to hear the voice of and the challenges in every kind of nation, and especially the developing ones that are behind the others in terms of reaching some goal, some of the goals that we mentioned. So definitely those are important challenges that everybody, even nations that are not at that stage, they need to listen and they need to help solve. So that's why also in the global partnership on AI, the most recent initiative, there are also states that are representing developing nations. But I think that more and more we need to be global. Global is very important. Different cultures, different stages of the development of a nation, so that we hear all these voices. We hear the voices of women, as we said, for the gender equity. We hear the voices in terms of all these other components and features that that I really think that global, and of course nations and different groups will disagree. What we always say inside the partnership on AI is that we practice this productive disagreement. When we are in a project, we have in the framework of productive disagreement. Means that it's okay to disagree, but let's be productive about this disagreement and move forward to solve the real problems.
Thank you very much, Francesca. We have way more questions that we don't have time for because we're past our time. I invite all the attendees to join the Slack channel. I think is in the chat. The link is in the chat, and you can continue the conversation, asking more questions and discussing on Slack because we have limited time. Again, I'd like everyone to join me and thank you, Francesca, for this wonderful, inspiring, and important blueprints. As our friend Kathleen Kraft-Bosman said, this is a really good blueprint for us to understand where we are today and how we chart the future of AI for Good together. You'll all see Francesca again in the next few days. We'll have the food track with some results that are coming out of that, but also on the 30th, we have a few announcements and result of these few days that Francesca will be with us as well to present.
Thank you, Amir.
Thank you all.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to address this audience. And wish you best of luck for the current edition, but also for the future of the AI for Good Summit.
Thank you very much. And I'll try to, now I would like to invite Xenia again just to help us close this session, but also give us some information about what's coming up next.
Thank you very much, Amir, and thank you for all your great questions, and of course our speakers for all your insights. I would like to invite our audience to join us to the workshops that will happen right after this session. And right now on your screens you can see the schedule. So we have 3 workshops in parallel: gender equity workshop that will take place in 5 minutes. Then we have future of food starting in around 20 minutes, and we have the pandemic intelligence workshop starting in around 35 minutes. If you would like to join us for these workshops, please register on our website, or if you already registered and participated yesterday, your connection link is still available and will be available tomorrow as well. So I would like to thank once again all our sponsors, partners, and Switzerland for your continuing support. Thank you, everyone, and I hope to see you after this break.
Selector, rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector.